and waiting for your family to do the right thing. And that was basically led to the catalyst to me becoming a campaigner, establishing this charity, Karma Nirvana, and speaking out, because nobody was speaking for her. And I did not want her death to be in vain. Everybody in my family then said, from this day forward, we don't talk about her again. And my mother's view was, it was better for her to take her life than for her to leave her husband and dishonor her family.
Hey guys, I'm Ashley Dawn Rivard, and you are now Into the Dawn, a provocative podcast that looks at all things taboo, such as suicide, grief, sex, addictions, and more. Each week, I talk with experts who successfully investigate their areas of interest. And if you like what you hear, please remember to subscribe. Jasvinder Sanghera was born and brought up in Derby. A survivor of forced marriage, she is the founder of Karma Nirvana, a national award-winning charity that supports both men and women affected by honor-based abuse and forced marriages. She is a highly acclaimed international speaker and an expert advisor to the courts in the matters of child, civil, and criminal proceedings. Her memoir, Shame, was a Times Top 10 bestseller and described in the House of Lords as a political weapon. Jasvinder is recognized as bringing the issue of forced marriages into the public domain, and Prime Minister David Cameron stated that her work turned my head on the issue of forced marriage. She has received numerous awards, including the prestigious Woman of the Year 2007. In 2011, she was listed in The Guardian's top 100 most inspirational women in the world. Is forced marriage the same thing as arranged marriage?
No, a forced marriage is very different to an arranged marriage. So if we think about an arranged marriage, we first of all have to understand that it is, in the UK's definition of what constitutes an arranged marriage, is you have to be age 16 and or above and be of sound mind, so have full mental capacity to make a decision as to whether to marry or not. So you have to be able to give consent. And what we know about an arranged marriage is that it is a tradition. You know, these traditions have been around for centuries to arrange one's marriage. They happen in many communities, not just South Asian communities. They happen in royalty, for example. The important thing to acknowledge is that the person has to give consent. So both parties have to say yes to mum, dad, or whoever that is arranging the marriage. I want this, and they have to give consent and agree to the arrangement. So the opposite is true of a forced marriage. A forced marriage is where one or both parties say, actually, I don't want this, mum, dad, and mum and dad say, well, sorry, it's happening. You've got no choice in the matter. And then duress becomes a factor. So this is when the families will coerce the person into forcing them into a marriage, or they may use physical abuse, they may use mental abuse to get them to see it. So if I look at my own personal experience, I'm one of 7 sisters, and I watched the majority of my sisters being taken out of education when they were 15, so when they were at school, and they had to marry strangers in India. And they were shown a photograph, but right up to the age of 15, they were coerced into thinking as young women that this is what we do. It's part of our tradition, it's part of our culture, even part of our religion. And off they went and married these strangers. So my mother would see that as not forced, but as her containing an arranged marriage tradition by coercing her children into these marriages. But it is clearly a forced marriage, because when you're a child, you don't recognize that. You know, these are your parents. You trust them. You believe they're acting in your best interests. So for me, when I was 14 years old, my mother showed me the photograph of a man I was to learn I was promised to from the age of 8. And I remember looking at this photograph as a 14-year-old thinking, he's shorter than me, he's older than me, I don't want to marry a stranger, and daring to say that to my mother, you know. And my mother was very clear in saying, no, this is what we do, you know, this is part of our culture is this is an arranged marriage. And I'm saying, but I don't want to marry him. I'm saying no, quite clearly. But she would make it fit to try to make me believe this was an arranged marriage. So this is why it's so important to acknowledge the differences. And, you know, even a 5-year-old would understand when he or she's been asked to do something or being forced to do something.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then when your mother showed you this photograph and you didn't want to do that, how did that play out?
Well, she, first of all, my mother had never come across any of her daughters ever retaliating or protesting. So it was quite odd for her that here was a daughter saying, no, I'm not marrying a stranger. So my mother was very clear that, you know, you are marrying this man. You will not dishonor this family by saying, no, this is what we do. I had to marry when I was a teenager. Why are you any different? And she gave me all the reasons. And then she resorted to emotional blackmail. I will die of a heart attack, she said, and it will be your fault. Your sister's marriages won't work and it will be your fault. So basically, as a 14-year-old child, here is your mother saying all these horrible things will happen in the family and you are going to be responsible for these things. So that trying to make you feel guilty, unworthy, and also making you feel that you're not the victim, but actually you are the perpetrator and you are capable of doing this to this family if you say no. So, you know, that was her view, and that was reinforced not just by my mother. And I think some people find it hard to believe that women are perpetrators in this space, because they are, but also the family ganging up on me. So, you know, my sisters, my brother, or other relatives making you feel as if you are you know, the perpetrator, the outsider, you know, what you're doing is clearly wrong. So then you're in this place of feeling incredibly isolated, feeling that you're the bad guy. And I went back to school until I was 15 and a half. And that was when I think my mother feared I will not honour this promise of marriage. I may run away from home or whatever. And that's when they took me out of education and they held me a prisoner in my own home until I agreed to the marriage.
What do you mean they held you a prisoner? What did that look like?
So what that looked like in reality, apart from what it felt like, so start with what it looked like, was I was taken out of education, and then I was locked in a room in my house, in my bedroom actually, with the padlock on the outside of the door, whereby if I needed to go to the bathroom, I had to knock on the door to let me out. Food was brought to the bedroom, and it was basically my mother punishing me until I saw sense. You know, you will marry this man, and until you agree, you will not be allowed out of this room. And I remember feeling incredibly isolated, alone. I attempted suicide. I took an overdose of tablets in the hope that, you know, they would see my point of view, see sense, but more importantly, allow me to go to the hospital. And then I could tell somebody. But the overdose didn't work because my sister said, if you think this is going to change anything, you're wrong. And so they plied with me with black coffee, made me walk up and down until I came around. So I wasn't even allowed any medical attention. So it's this feeling of immense isolation, where you're reduced to nothing, actually, until you actually are helpless to the point where you can't even think freely. So, and the biggest thing for me was that these are the people who are meant to love me more than anybody, being my family, doing this to me. And it's rationalizing that as well, but also feeling that, you know, these are the people that you love. I love them. This is my mother and father. This is my family. And am I really that bad that I'm doing this to them? So in the end, I agreed to the marriage purely to be able to be freer, in the sense that I could be out of that room that I was locked in, that I was tormented in. And that's what happened. They said, okay, she's seeing sense now. And I was allowed freedom of movement around the house. And for anybody, you know, their wedding day should be one of the happiest days of their life. And I describe it as having a bird's eye view, looking down on all these wedding arrangements happening, whereas I was expected to consider the wedding dress, relatives, all the plans. And it was a wedding that happened to be mine when actually I had no feeling towards it whatsoever.
And then, so how long did you agree with that before you changed your mind?
For me, it was a matter of weeks actually when I overheard my mother making the plans for the arrangements for me to go to India. And I knew, and I've seen this with my sisters, I saw it happened with my other sisters, so it was inevitable that when you hear about the travel plans happening, the tickets being purchased to go to India, you knew it was imminent, because they're not going to tell you. Your family don't tell you when you will be going, it will just happen. So I knew it was imminent, and it was on that day that I planned my escape. And I was seeing somebody in secret, a secret boyfriend, who was my best friend's brother. And I was allowed to go to my best friend's house because she was Indian, we were Indian, because I know we haven't talked about an honor system, but one of the dishonorable things and the shameful things within a family dynamic that forces their children to marry is that they don't want you to integrate into Western society. So I was never allowed white friends. My mother actually said to me how the worst insult I could bring to her front door is that I was to behave like a white woman, which is totally bigoted, but it is the truth. There was this them and us philosophy that existed. But I was allowed Asian friends, and this was an Asian friend of mine, and I told her brother what was happening to me, and he was a little bit older than me, and he agreed to help me escape. So I made these plans literally, through passing messages through my friend. And it's true to say that I lowered my suitcases from a bedroom window on sheets into the backyard where he collected them. It sounds very Romeo and Juliet, but it wasn't. I was escaping a forced marriage. And then on that day, I just ran. I just went out the front door and I ran to where he worked. And I kid you not, I knew the name of the place, but I didn't know where it was. But my legs moved so fast, they took me to this place where he worked. And he came out and I said, we have to go, and we have to go now. We have to go today. They're going to force me into marriage. I was 16. And then he said, okay, I believe you. And we ran away, to the top of the UK. I lived in the middle of the UK, almost 200 miles away. And I ran away to make the point that I wanted my parents to understand that I was 16. I didn't want to marry a stranger, and I wanted to go to school. That was my point of view. And my family reported me missing to the police. The police did find me. And I begged this police officer not to send me home, because had he sent me home, I would have been forced into marriage. But equally, my mother and father would have given the Oscar-winning performance on the front doorstep as to why they wouldn't force me into a marriage. And it would have been fine. They would have compromised, because no parent is going to admit they're forcing their child into a marriage. But he did say this. He said, look, promise me you will ring home and tell your family you are safe and well. And that was the point my life changed, because this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to ring home for them to say, okay, you've made your point, you can come back. So I rang home. I was in a telephone box. And I remember the conversation with my mother as if it were an hour ago, let's say. I'm on the phone and I say to her, Mum, I want to come home. I want to go to school, dare I say college or university, but I won't marry that man. And my mother said, you either come home and marry who we say, or from this day forward, you are dead in our eyes. And I hope you give birth to a daughter who does to you what you have done to me. Then you will know what it feels like to raise a prostitute. And I remember the words echoing in my head and me repeating, but I want to come home, I'm only just 16. And her reiterating how I had a choice. I could have my family and everything I've ever known, but I would have to marry this stranger and conform to an honest system that deprives a woman of rights, freedom, the right to choose who you want to marry, the right to your sexuality, whatever. Or the other choice was, you can have everything that a democracy stands for: freedom, rights, independence, right to choose who you want to marry as a woman, but it means not having your family. So as a 16-year-old, I was in this space having to be confronted with this choice, and it was a choice. And I made the decision not to go back. And for anybody hearing this, I would ask them to walk with me in empathy to understand it in this way. It's like me asking you to imagine waking up tomorrow morning and never seeing a member of your family ever again and being made to feel it was your fault. And that's disownment. That's estrangement. And subsequently, I've been disowned by my family for just over 40 years now. So they refuse to acknowledge me, my children, or my grandchildren. And over the years, if I went back to my hometown and I saw my sisters, they'd physically cross the road and ignore me. But I've moved on since then now. But that's the
Oh, okay. Hold on. Let me back up, because my mouth, as you see, I'm like, my jaw's dropped. I mean, okay. So You're 16 years old. That's the last time you spoke to your mother.
I tried to reconcile so many times. So it wasn't the last time I spoke to my mother. There've been occasions where I tried.
Okay. But you have not had any relationship with your family, even extended family?
No, as it stands today, none of my family speak to me. They refuse to acknowledge me. Before my mother died and my father died, I had a relationship, but on their terms. So, for example, I could only see them if the other members of the family were not there. Our relationship was a secret, put it that way. But it was tiny snippets of them on their terms. And for me, I accepted that because it was better than absolutely nothing.
It was secret because of the honor system? It was more important for them to be perceived in a certain way?
Yeah, their biggest fear was that if my brother or my other sisters or the broader community saw them talking openly and freely to me, then they wouldn't be accepted. So they were in that space of, I suppose, you see, my parents came from India in the late 1950s to Britain, invited by UK government in search of work. And they brought with them their belief, their value systems. They didn't stop those at Heathrow Airport. And one of the fundamental things, what was the arranged marriage system, the extended family networks, and ascribing to a life, certainly for women, my mother especially, whereby you lived your life according to what other people think of you, what your status is, your reputation within that community. So that was very fixed for them. And so what I can say about that is, for me, I forgive them completely, because they were only doing what they thought was best. It doesn't make it right. But then when I look at my sisters who are British born, having the same views, there's no excuse.
I mean, you were then what did you do? You had no family. I can imagine what you were feeling, but please do share. Like, what did those next few years look like for you emotionally? And how did you keep the strength to be true to what you thought was right?
You see, from the age of 16, I would say, to 19, before I gave birth to my first child, Natasha, I was 19 and a half. I describe my years from 16 to 19 as living in a space in a room with a window with the curtains drawn. And it was such a dark place. And I suffered from depression. I again attempted to take my life twice. I was missing my family terribly. That's the big thing, is the void, the absence, and, craving their love and craving their acceptance. I wanted them to love me. I wanted them to accept me, but also accept me for the choice that I was making not to marry a stranger. But every time I tried to connect with them, I would be further catapulted into rejection. And the isolation is so immense that, I didn't stop trying to connect until I was almost to the point that I almost had this wake-up call, I suppose, when I became pregnant. In a sense, you're in that space where you keep on hoping today will be the day that your mother talks to you. I'm pregnant, I'm having a baby, you want your mother to be there. But even that, my mother didn't want to know. So this sense of your unworthiness is something that affects your self-esteem, your confidence. I became agoraphobic in that I couldn't leave the room without clinging onto my partner's arm because I had a phobia of people walking towards me. The point I'm making is trauma impacts people in different ways. And that trauma led me to believing I was worthless. I had done this to my family. I was shameful. I was somebody that, when I tried to connect with them, I used to describe it as walking into a house that was on fire. You were going to leave and an element of you is going to be burnt. But I carried on in the hope that something would move them, but it didn't. So, those years were, probably very isolating and lonely in that you question your sheer existence. I could describe myself as a dead person walking.
I couldn't even
imagine. The
numbness
numbness is so real.
I mean, oh man, not only just like one person not speaking to you and your family, which is obviously hard enough, but to basically have it across the board and then to feel like it's your fault and carry like that baggage with you. When were you able to transform that to empowerment?
For me, the turning point was the death of my sister. So that's my turning point, in that Rubina was 2 years older than me. She was forced to marry at the age of 15 years old. And me and my sister Rubina had a secret relationship. So sometimes when you're disowned, you do have secret relationships with members of your family, and she was one of them. And my sister suffered a horrific marriage. She suffered domestic abuse, physical and psychological abuse. And I was in my early 20s then. She was in her middle 20s. And I would see her when I was allowed, on her terms, in secret. And she would describe this abuse to me, but then she didn't even have to describe it to me. I could see visibly the bruises on her body. And when I was in her house, you could see holes in the wall, smashed glass. You could see things because it's domestic abuse. She was living with a man that abused her. And she also had a young son from her first marriage, because she married for the second time for love. Marrying for love is an alien concept, by the way, for us, because if you have an arranged marriage, you grow to love somebody. But my family allowed her to marry the second time because this man ticked all the boxes, and they basically said, but it's a love marriage, and if it doesn't work, don't come to us. Okay? But he was in the Indian, same religion, he was Sikh, same caste, because my family believed in the caste system. So I would say to Rubina, come and stay with me, I'll protect you from him. And the reason I said that to her was because she went to my mother, she went to my family, the community leader was called out from the Indian community, and they all told her to go back to this abuser for the sake of the family's reputation, for the sake of the family's honor.
And they knew she was being beaten.
Yeah. She showed them the physical injuries, and she was desperately saying, he's abusing me. And I would say to my sister, well, come and live with me, I'll protect you. And she would say, it's easy for you to say that because you don't have to think about izzat, which translates as honor. And she was absolutely right, because I had created a life where I was on the outside of the family now. So my decision making didn't put that concept and the family and what people think first, that came second now. And that's in a sense what I left home for, you know. And so she was still rooting all her decision making in what the family think, what community think, the honour of the family. And the fact that the family are sending her back to a perpetrator and telling her to try even harder for the sake of the family was something she would do. So she did. And then at that time, I was around 23, 24 years old. And a stranger came to me and said, you need to ring home because something has happened to your sister. Because when you're disowned by your family, you don't hear about births, deaths. I have no idea who is alive and not alive in my family as I talk to you right now. And this woman told me to ring home, and she knew my family. So I asked her why, and she wouldn't tell me. So I rang home. So this would be the second time that me and my mother would have a conversation on the phone. So I ring home and I say to her, something has happened. What's happened? And my mother says, it's Rabina. She's died. She's dead. And I said, how has she died, Mum? You know, she was my younger sister. We walked to school together. I seen her just a week ago. What do you mean dead? How has she died? And then my mother said, she's set herself on fire and committed suicide. I remember in that split second thinking, no, what do you mean? She set herself on fire. She's committed suicide. And then my mother repeated that this had happened. And I remember saying, I'm coming to the house now, to my parents' house, because I wanted to grieve with them. I wanted to be somewhere connected to people that is part of my family and my sister. And then my mother saying to me, no, whatever you do, do not come here. This doesn't change anything. You're still dead in our eyes. And, you know, if you do come, because she knew me, you can come when it's dark and nobody sees your face. And I remember saying to her, but Mum, you know, Rupina's dead. Are you not going to allow me? I actually believed, and you have to remember, here was I, as somebody who'd spent so many years waiting for their acceptance, waiting for a word for them to see my point of view or some compassion. And I thought Rubina's death would be a space where my mother would think, do you know, I've lost a daughter in such a horrific way. This is a point in my life now where I should accept Jasvinder. But it didn't. It actually reinforced my disownment because I was told I couldn't come to the funeral, I couldn't show my face, I was disowned, this doesn't change anything. And it was that for me that created a turning point of actually owning that I was a victim and I wasn't the perpetrator. I hadn't done this to my family, but Rubina's not coming back. So it was her death that actually led to my salvation, I suppose you could call it in a way, because it woke me up into accepting that stop putting your life on hold and waiting for your family to do the right thing. And that was basically led to the catalyst to me becoming a campaigner, establishing this charity, Karma Nirvana, and speaking out because nobody was speaking for her. And I did not want her death to be in vain. Everybody in my family then said, from this day forward, we don't talk about her again. And my mother's view was, it was better for her to take her life than for her to leave her husband and dishonor her family.
Oh my God. Wow. I mean, the way you speak about it, I mean, this obviously is something probably more normalized in the culture, but I can't even wrap my head around or my emotion around. It's almost like something has to be disconnected, right, within the human spirit to treat a loved one like that or think of a loved one. It just doesn't make any sense to me, because which I want to get into is the honor killings and how that works. And I was reading on it and how these family members kill their own. It's all women, right? It's not men. Men are not being killed in honor killings.
Men are killed, but not at the same scale of women.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So were you ever, first of all, I just want to say I'm so sorry about the loss of your sister. I mean, that is the most horrific thing to happen. And as you're still trying to process your own stuff and then deal with that, I can't even imagine. You're so strong and courageous to keep going. Oh, the honor killings. Were you ever afraid that your family would kill you? Or first of all, how do they work? Like, what are the honor killings specifically a byproduct of forced marriages?
I think the first thing to say is that it would be helpful for people listening to understand what an honor system is. So it's the way I can describe it to you is to describe it from the perspective of my own experience in how I understood an honor system. And it's important to acknowledge that these honor systems exist amongst many communities, including Jewish communities, South Asian, Kurdish, African, Iranian communities. So many communities operate this system whereby it is designed to deprive individuals, especially women, of their independence. So by the age of 6 years old, I understood that as girls, we literally had to be seen but not heard. We could not cut our hair. We had to dress modestly. We couldn't sit with men. We had to sit separately as young girls. Even in our place of worship, men and women sat separately. Then by the time I got to the age of 11, into my adolescent years, and this is where there's a really big challenge to an honor system, we understood that we couldn't talk to boys, not date boys, not even make eye contact. We couldn't wear makeup. We had to dress modestly. We couldn't go out with our friends. We were not allowed to integrate. The point I'm making is that we were told these things were shameful, so dishonorable. So if we did any of these things, then we would be punished. Okay, we could put ourselves at risk. Physical punishment, mental abuse, but also it could be a trigger for a rushed marriage. So Jasvinder's not behaving according to our expected level of behaviour, so let's get her married off, that's the way we'll deal with her. And it is about controlling female sexuality. It clearly is. But when I think about men, especially gay men, when gay men they found out that they are gay, that is seen as dishonorable, and families will force them into marriages to hide their sexuality. Now I say that because when I developed the charity Karma Nirvana, of all the thousands of men that call the helpline that I developed in 93, the majority are gay men being forced into marriages to hide their sexuality.
To women.
So an honor system is where we're being controlled. It's coercion. We're being disciplined, and the people enforcing this on us are our parents, family members, uncles, aunties. And if we don't adhere to the expected level of behaviours according to an honor system, then we will be punished. We could be forced into marriage, or in the extreme, we could be killed. And this is why you call it an honor killing. So from the family's perspective, she's not a victim. So if I've dishonored my family because I've got a secret boyfriend, let's say, for example. So Banaz Mahmood was a Kurdish girl that lived in East London. She had a secret boyfriend. Her family found out she had a secret boyfriend. So they don't see anybody but somebody, their own daughter, who's capable of dishonoring their family. So she's a perpetrator now. She's causing shame on the family. And because of that, they want to deal with her. And in Banaz's case, tragically, 5 male members of her family. They garroted her, repeatedly raped her, and then put her body in a suitcase and buried it under her house. That was her father, her uncle, 3 other members of the family. But according to them, they had to do that to restore the honor of the family. So the motivation for the murder is honor related. So they see it in some sick way of reclaiming the honor. So they will see it as justifiable. So these are what we call premeditated murders, very well thought out murders by family members who take it upon themselves to deal with our victims. So yeah, there's no explanation actually to say, and I've, in my campaigning years of the past 29 years, I've dealt with cases where mothers have murdered their daughters, and I cannot rationalize as a mother myself, how can a mother kill their own daughter? Ruxana Naz went to my school in the UK. I got away, she didn't. When she was 15, she had a secret boyfriend, and her family saw that as such a dishonorable thing that they took her to Pakistan, forced her to marry a stranger. By the time she was 19 years old, she had 2 children, and she was now 7 months pregnant. Her mother suspected the child she was carrying was not her husband's, and that would be too shameful for her to give birth to a child that wasn't her husband's. There was no evidence that it wasn't her husband's. So what the mother did was, she sees Ruxana as somebody who has the power to dishonor the family. So she calls a family meeting with Ruxana, her 2 sons, an older brother, a younger brother. And she says to Ruxana, and again, this goes back to that choice, I don't believe the child you are carrying is your husband's. I believe you're having an affair with your childhood sweetheart. You have 2 choices. You either abort that child at 7 months or we will kill you. So Ruxana refused. Her mother sat on her legs while her brother strangled her to death. And when her brother killed her, he kissed her forehead and said to her, "This is the only way." And this was all said in court. This was all played out in court. And the important thing to remember is that there was no remorse.
This is happening today.
Yeah. And across the world, and certainly in the States, in the United States, there are honor killings across. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But it's illegal across the board, correct?
It's illegal everywhere. Murder is illegal, and this is murder. And what families will try to claim are crimes of passion or cultural defenses. This is part of my culture, and I had no choice but to kill my daughter in this way. That's what they will try to do. But what we have to acknowledge is that this is cold-blooded murder. If I was walking in the streets and I killed a stranger, it should be doubly worse because I've killed a member of my family. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah, the house where you live is meant to be the safest place for you as a child.
Absolutely.
And you are being put at risk by the people that are meant to protect you. Exactly.
That you trust. Mm-hmm. So how many people roughly, I know you can't probably specify exactly, but with all your experience now, do you have a ballpark number of forced marriages going on and honor abuse and honor killings happening to date?
Well, in the UK, we have a government forced marriage unit, and they deal with up to around 7,000 calls to their helpline every year. And they're repatriating, rescuing from abroad over 200 British citizens every year who are taken out of this country and forced into marriages as young as 5 years old. A third of these people are under the age of 17. Now, the issue we have is that this is so underreported, because what you have to remember is that the victim has multiple perpetrators. There's never one. So you've got mum, dad, aunt, younger brothers, sisters, so many. If I count the perpetrators when I was younger, I wouldn't have enough fingers and thumbs. So if I look at the Karma Nirvana helpline, that's a charity I founded in 1993. In 2008, we developed the national helpline. Since its inception, that helpline has dealt with well over 98,000 calls. And this is just the UK. But currently that helpline is dealing with over 900 calls every month in the UK.
And as you know, and I could probably attest to this being on the suicide crisis line, that's just the people who have the courage to pick up the phone.
Exactly. So the point is, what government recognise, and I agree with them on this point, is that we're dealing with the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. You know, that beneath it, we have no idea.
Absolutely.
Because what you also have to remember about this abuse, as with me, when I was younger, we are conditioned to believe this is part of our culture.
It's all your work.
You know, this is part of our tradition, our religion. You know, the saying I coined years ago was how cultural acceptance does not mean accepting the unacceptable.
Yeah.
It's not part of my culture to be abused. You know, and when I was at Karma Nirvana, I used to have an inbox called the beggar belief cases, you know, where you put your head in your hands and think, is that for real? Did that just happen? And I remember this police officer ringing the helpline, and he said to the call handler, I'm calling you because you deal with the issues of culture. So I'm just checking out about this case. I've got this man with me. You know, he's from a minority background, and he's telling me he's in a full-blown relationship with this 12-year-old girl. And I just wanted to check if this was acceptable in your culture. So, you know, the call handler is saying, officer, you know, this is somebody who enforces the law. If I may, let's just remove culture from this. And let's think what we have here in terms of the possible raft of offences. You know, in a full-blown relationship with a minor, you know, grooming, you know, lots of things here. And he needed reminding of the fact that, you know, culture mustn't trump what clearly is a safeguarding issue.
Right. So what I'm also hearing, like when I was diving into this topic and looking at it, I was like, I know this is a cultural thing and it's traditional, but the issue at hand, right, is, this is what I think, it's just an opinion, an outdated belief system of women have no rights. And that's still happening there, right? Like women are seen as less than. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what then is the solution to all of this?
I think the real important thing is, I mean, I always say I'm not special. There are thousands of men and women like me who are now challenging their families and fundamentally speaking out. And that comes with a cost. All the time it does. One of the important things for me as a campaigner was that, you know, I campaigned for law in Britain. We've never had a criminal offence of forced marriage. I campaigned for 10 years, and then forced marriage finally became a criminal offence in 2013. So a country that recognises forced marriage as a criminal offence. It's not part of, you know, an arranged marriage. It's not a tradition. It's not part of one's religion. It's against the law. So it's important to have law. It's important to have helplines. So charities that, like Karma Nirvana, you know, are campaigners, and we now have a helpline service. Currently, we're campaigning to raise the age of consent of marriage from 16 to 18. So in Britain, you can get married at the age of 16 with parental consent. But we know that consent in these cases is coerced. So we're fighting and campaigning right now to increase it to 18. And certainly the states have got a real issue, because in your states, in some states, you can get married legally at the age of 12. You know, that's
Wait, I'm sorry. Did you just say United States?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can get married in some of your states under the age of 16 quite legally, and in some at the age of 12. So, you know, you have organizations that I've worked with in New York, like Unchained at Last, who are campaigning for federal law to become laws where you have a criminal offence. That's what you're aiming for. So the point I'm making is the solution is to have effective laws for countries to recognise that there is no place for forced marriage, to have laws whereby children are not expected to marry under the age of 16 or 16. It should be 18 in line with other countries. And that people like me who have been disowned by their family, for my children, it's a total blank on their mother's side when it comes to her family. But I wouldn't swap what they have. They have freedom and independence and rights, and they are empowered human beings. So it's important that victims hear people like me and others, and so our presence is shown, and that we acknowledge those people who have been murdered for the honourable people that they are, or were, should I say. And that's why I, campaign for, here in Britain, we have a National Day of Remembrance now for men and women who are murdered by their families in what I call dishonourable killings. And it's July the 14th, which is the birthday of murdered teenager Shafilia Ahmed. She was murdered by her mother and father when she was 17 years old.
Wow. So have you seen a lot of progress in the system since you've been working on this?
Yeah, I mean, I've been campaigning for nearly 29 years now. And Karma Nirvana, is 29 years old now almost. Yeah, I have. But, in the first 7 years of campaigning, I couldn't get more than one or two people that heard what I had to say, because they couldn't comprehend this happening in Britain. No, this is happening in some far off country over there, certainly not in Britain, a democracy. I'm sure people in the United States will be thinking this doesn't happen in the United States.
That's why I was like, this isn't happening in the United States. What are you talking about?
Yeah. But where you have a minority group, believe me, this will be happening. So I've seen progress, but progress happens where people are willing to break the silences and willing to talk about this and accept it and acknowledge it for what it is. And it's about shifting hearts and minds. It's about police forces recognize this as a crime and not watering it down because it's cultural, and recognizing that professionals such as teachers and social workers, doctors, need training to recognize that family members are perpetrators. Otherwise, they will be talking to perpetrators. You would normally go and speak to the parents if you have an issue with a child at school. But in these cases, by talking to parents, you could be putting that person at greater risk of a forced marriage. So it's about understanding how it is different in this space. And the big thing I think people need to understand is that these victims have multiple perpetrators, and those perpetrators are the people who are meant to love them the most. If they just understood that, so that they engage with the victim first and not the family, that would be some way to achieving progress. Because I know professionals, inadvertently even, will I say, or because of a lack of knowledge, can put victims at risk not knowing that.
And do you think that these people who are the perpetrators secretly would like to abolish this tradition, but nobody's willing to continually stand up to it?
I believe there are people that are thinking like that. Yes, I do. And for me, because what you have to remember is that the parents will be pressured by other people in the family dynamic and the community, not only in the country that they're in, but the countries where they're from. So India or Pakistan, let's say, for example. And a testimony to this for me is my father. So my father had a secret relationship with me right up until his death. Years down the line of being disowned, I continued. Then when my mother died, my father would see me, but on his terms, if the family were not there, and that was fine for me. And then when my father died, out of all the children, he put me in charge of his will. With one other sister, because in this country, you have to have two people down. But the point I'm making is, in death, he spoke 1,000 words because nobody could say anything to him then. So in a way, he was saying, I am proud of you. I trust you. But he could never say that to me when he was alive. And I remember having the keys to his house, the house I grew up in, for the first time, and walking into this house. And out of all my sisters, I was the only one that graduated from university. I didn't read a book, by the way, Ashley, until I was 28 years old. And then I published 3. I wrote my story and I wrote books, and then I graduated at university. And I remember ringing my dad and begging him to come to my graduation, and he didn't. Okay, because he could have been seen, my family could have seen him, and they'd have asked him 100 questions. And I began to come into a place where I began to accept that and understand it. As long as I had some of him, I accepted that, because I was understanding his position. You know, that the point you made earlier about, do you think some of these families want to push against it but are too afraid to, or, you know, all those things in terms of the repercussions that they know exist. So what I did was I sent my father my graduation picture, okay? Just like I used to send pictures of my children growing up. Whether my family looked at them or not is another thing. I sent them. So when my father died, I walked into the house and I walked around the rooms and I went to his bedroom. And in the corner of the bedroom was a picture on the wall. You really had to look, otherwise you would have missed it. And it was my graduation picture in the corner of the room. So what that tells me is that, you know, my dad was proud. He did trust me, but he couldn't say that to me until you'd gone. And that's the power of an honor system. And also, it's the power of such loss. You know, all the things that we could have shared, actually, we're never going to get them back. The point I'm making is that this doesn't happen in isolation. It happens because people within families and communities allow it to happen.
To keep the narrative going.
Exactly.
Wow. Yeah. You know, similar, but not similar. You know, I did a podcast on female genital mutilation with a woman in Kenya. And when I asked her what the solution to ending this is, she said, because like your culture, when you were explaining that women they aren't seen with any worth, right? To have a voice, to pump them up, to go to school. She said, you can't go into this culture and say what you are doing is wrong. You have to go in and have a dialogue, have a conversation, understand where they are coming from, and then start, you know, up-leveling the idea that perhaps there's a different way to think. You know, that perhaps this is an outdated belief system, not making them wrong, giving them a space. And so that's just kind of how and I'm sure you see on your helpline too, is it's a lot of validation, suicide line, all of it, right? You don't make anyone wrong for what they're going through, but it's how can we just plant a seed that perhaps there's a different way to think. And it's okay, you know, that if you know, if everything is evolving and evolution, and why would we as a species not be evolving, you know?
You see, for me, when I was the CEO for Karma Nirvana, I tried to put my hand out to develop that dialogue with communities, but they spent more time trying to shut me down. And I've dealt with life-threatening risks towards me and my children or my family. That's how I see them. You know, through death threats, through having threats of bombs under my car, being taught to look for bombs under my car. The point I'm making is I made the decision constructively not to wait to have that dialogue. I carried on speaking out. So for me, my energy, and even now I would say the same, is it's taken to speak to those who are affected by these issues and to remind them that they're not on their own. Take a day to step back from all the lies and half-truths you've been told over the years and actually recognize yourself as being the innocent person here, having the right to be independent, to choose who you want to marry, to have freedom of thoughts is not a sin. It's not a bad thing. And yes, I accept we want our family to support, love, and encourage our dreams, but sometimes we have to step out alone to make a new start, to create a new path, and to let them know it is possible. It is. I'm living proof. So I've spent most of my energy in my lifetime in that space. And that's where I'm going to continue doing so.
So just to wrap it up, would you say that, do you feel at peace with your decision that you made when you were 16?
Being at peace with my decision when I was 16 came to me when I had children, and later on in my life, because as I've watched my children, none of us want our children to go without things. Okay, we want them to have the life that we never had, or the regrets that we've had in our life. We want to give our children more and better. That's how most parents live their lives. And I couldn't give my children family on their mother's side, but what I could give them is unconditional love and regard, and a life that I never had, that was built on a foundation of truth, honesty, protection, me being their soft place if they ever fell, all those things. And I remember when my daughter Natasha married, and she wanted to have the big fat Indian wedding. She married an Indian young man who's a beautiful young man. And, we had over 300 guests there, but not one member of my family was there. And I felt this huge pang of sorrow for her. And, she did nothing but make me feel stronger. But I remember looking at her doing her first dance on the dance floor and thinking, she would not have had that day if I had not made that decision when I was 16 years old. And for me, that puts me at peace, because I could have gone back. I could have married that stranger. Then my children would have inherited that legacy of abuse. But now they don't. And neither will, exactly. And neither will my grandchildren. And it's worth it for that. And it's really hard for a victim to think so far in the future and making decisions for the sake of your future children. But you have to, because the one thing I can tell you is that if you are forced into a marriage, it goes on into the next generation and the next generation. So break it, because you can.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. And you have 3 books you've written: Shame, Shame Travels, and Daughters of Shame, all discussing this, correct?
Yeah, so shame is my personal story. And just to say, the reason why I use the word shame is because I've reclaimed the word. So the point I'm making is that my family made me believe I'd shame them. And actually what I say is now, my honor is your shame. So I'm reclaiming the word. Yeah. So that's why I use it. I use the word from a perspective of a position of strength. So it's my story is shame. And then the second book is a story of other women. And the third book is when I went to India, because in my own right, because my father said to me, I was never allowed to go to India, the place where, my heritage comes from. I was interested. And he said I would never be allowed to go because shame travels. So basically, you shamed your family in the UK, you shamed them in India. So I went in my own right and I wrote about that journey, basically.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
I love that. Just thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for the time.
That's it for today's podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. Please let me know what you think. Leave a comment, share, and we'll be back next week with a new episode.